Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm Nick Stern and I'm here today with Veena Attivilli, an MBA student here at the Kelley School of Business, who over the summer went on a summer deployment. Veena, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Nick.
So to start, I was wondering if you could just tell our viewers a little bit about the summer deployment program and kind of the process you went through to get involved.
Okay. So MBA office does summer deployments wherein it selects a few students from the MBA program, usually the second years, to go on these team deployments where they are sent to different countries around the world. And during those 2 weeks, the students are tasked with understanding their client, understanding their project, and also delivering the final deliverables and presentation, all within those 2 weeks. We did different international or social or enterprise trips, and a few students from that pool and who are interested in leading those for the next year round are usually the pool for the team deployments. But other than that, even if you're really willing and want to hone your leadership skills, then this is actually a great platform.
So at what point did you find out that you were going to be traveling to Guatemala?
I believe exactly 2.5 weeks before is when we got an email from Anna, who is the liaison at the MBA office for these kind of trips, and she told us that we will be going to Guatemala, and she gave me my team members. Yeah.
So at the time you deployed, you didn't even know who you were going to be on a team with?
No. Initially, when we interviewed for this process, we didn't even know what are the countries they were talking about. So that was a complete surprise. We didn't know who our teammates were going to be. That was a second surprise. And the biggest surprise was Anna told us that you would be going to Guatemala, but I still had no inkling about what project I would be working on.
So at what point did you find out the project, and what actually was the project you worked on when you were in country?
Well, after a week, after Anna made the teams and she informed us that we will be going to Guatemala, after a week we had our first Skype meeting with our client to tell us more about the organization. We still at that point did not discuss anything about the project in itself. We just got a small intro to the organization, and the organization that I worked with during those 2 weeks was FUNDAP. FUNDAP is an not-for-profit organization based in Guatemala, and usually it caters to a large portion of western side of Guatemala in helping the underprivileged and impoverished people in many different ways.
So what was your objective in working with FUNDAP?
So the objective of our project was they are already catering to the underprivileged children and students and mothers and in different levels, and they are basically dependent on the funds from Europe. And because of the crisis in Europe, the funds that they are receiving have decreased over a period of time. So the general manager of FUNDAP right now wants us to devise a plan so that we can make FUNDAP more self-sustainable. So when they had 6 business units, which are completely not-for-profit oriented, he wanted us to create one business unit which would generate revenues, and those earnings would be plowed into this 6 units.
So I wonder if you could talk a little about some of the challenges that you and the rest of the team faced in terms of environmental challenges that are present in Guatemala.
Definitely. The first challenge was a Skype call that we had almost like 10 days before we took off. I did not understand anything that was going on. I'm not a Spanish speaker. I just know a few words, hola, and a couple of other things, and there ends my Spanish learning. And when this conversation was going on, I had no clue what was going on. I did not even know what was being said. My teammates were considerate enough to stop the other person once in a while and explain things to me, but there was still that anxiety about, oh my god, what's happening? Oh my god, I'm not understanding, and if I'm unable to understand, how will I contribute? So I had that let's say anxiousness while going into the project. And once we were in Guatemala, I come from India, it's a developing country, and somewhere I had this confidence that I would be able to relate to Guatemala in many different ways. But what I understood is after going to Guatemala and looking at everything around, though they're all developing countries, there's so many differences, and there was so much that I needed to learn. And understand and think in different ways.
I wonder if you give me talk about some of the things that you weren't expecting that really surprised you when you were in country.
Couple of things that surprised me were English was not used at all. So in India, we at least say okay and thanks and words like this in English. And once you have those words, you can construct a sentence or at least have an idea of what was being said. But in Guatemala, one thing I really realized was every word was in Espanol. And that left me no clue and kept me guessing as to what was being said. And the second and the most important thing was I loved their hospitality. That was surprising in a way, but it was, they did not understand my language. I did not understand their language. And the food, I'm a vegetarian, so they did not understand the concept of a vegetarian food. These were a few of the challenges that I encountered. But on a different level, if you're talking about the project that we did and what are the challenges that we encountered when we were doing those, I think they had a different mindset of what was being done and what they wanted to achieve, and opening them to other possibilities around what was happening in different countries, what were the other developing nations doing to tackle the same problems that Guatemala is facing was actually a challenge.
So when you say they had a different mindset, I was wondering if you could go into more detail and what you mean by that.
So when I said they have a different mindset, I meant was their research or their know-how on things was limited to what was happening in Guatemala at that point in time. So even if they were thinking about things in a creative way or whenever they were coming up with initiatives, that was pretty much restricted to what was happening in Guatemala based on the constraints that they have right now. And one of the big tasks that we had to do was research about what's happening in Peru, what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in India, what's happening in, let's say, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, different countries, and tell them that this is being done differently. Maybe these are the things that we can open ourselves to. And whenever you have a different idea and you are presenting, people are a little worried or nervous about how do we take it forward. This happened there doesn't mean this will work here. So establishing that trust, and we just had 2 weeks to establish that trust and credibility for them to believe us and take these recommendations seriously.
Do you think you were able to build that sort of trust in such a short time frame?
Yes. A fact that all of us are MBA students at the Kelley School of Business, but we are willing to spend 2 weeks in Guatemala learning all these things and traveling to any place and any distance just to learn something, I think gave them a great confidence in us. So the way our trip was planned was on a few days they had a fixed itinerary, and on the other days they left it wide open for us. And we used those open days to generate this kind of trust, because whenever we had questions, we expressed those questions and concerns to them, and we asked them that we are eager to learn more. And when they saw our inquisitiveness and how interested we were in learning, and we were even ready to travel like 4 hours up and 4 hours down just to get 2 or 3 questions answered. I think this kind of commitment that we displayed during those 2 weeks gave or established that kind of trust, not just with us, but with Kelley School of Business.
So it sounds like an extremely challenging project, especially given all of the timeline constraints. So I'm wondering what made you decide to apply to be a member of a team deployment?
The very fact that there are these constraints, that time is a constraint, building credibility and trust is a constraint, and you don't know what you're getting into, is what actually accelerated me to apply for Guatemala, apply for team deployments in general. And one thing I really learned was once you get into things and you try to solve the puzzle one bit at a time, aids a lot to your learning than knowing everything beforehand, doing a whole deal of research on the country and the project and everything else. But even having that kind of prep work done will not help you because you're unable to build that credibility. So I thought this was the best challenge. This could be one of the best experiences I can have at Kelley.
Well, it sounds like you really loved it. I was wondering if there's any a particular experience you had that really stood out for you that you'd be willing to share with us?
We went to the tomato farmers. We were speaking to the tomato farmers, and we were speaking to the beans farmers. And French beans and tomatoes are basically cultivated so that they can be sold. They're not consumed. Tomatoes are consumed to an extent, but beans are not at all consumed in Guatemala. That's a completely export business. So in every field that we walked into, they had a cost accounting kind of chart with our revenues, with our expenses, and profit margins and things like that. And when we started looking at those kind of things and just did crunch the numbers on our own, the margins that we looked at were very different from the margins that they were looking at. And immediately it rings a bell, and you pull out a couple of tricks that you learn from cost accounting and other accounting courses from your Kelley. And we just then and there sat with them and explained them the basics of fixed costs and variable costs and the way they need to account for those two things to look at profitability in a more holistic way than in a very narrow way. So they were realizing profits on paper, but they were not having that kind of money so that they can plow it back into their business. So when we told them that this is how you need to account for it and this is how you need to think about it when you are budgeting, that gave them a whole different idea. And the transformation that we saw just then and there was awesome.
What was their reaction?
They were like, oh, we did not think about it that way. Or we did not know that fixed costs are different from variable costs. Or even the understanding that, okay, these types of costs are fixed costs and these type of costs are variable costs. So they found it very educative, and they found that they don't have to rely on the funds ever so often if they just made a few changes to what they were doing, both in paper and in practice.
That's great. Now, you've talked a lot about some of the great experience you had working on the project. I was wondering if you had time also to do some sort of sightseeing or experience the country outside of the project work.
Yes. So the best thing about our project was we were working to understand all the 6 business units of FUNDAP, and FUNDAP was widespread in the western area of Quetzaltenango. So each time we had to understand one business unit, we would travel to the coast. The second day we would travel to the mountains. So every day in itself was an excursion, a nice picnic trip. But over the weekends when we had some downtime, FUNDAP was very nice to host us and to take us to different places. We went to Antigua. That was, I think I still have a picture of that in my mind. That was beautiful, and we went to the hot water springs. And a lot of places in itself are so scenic that when we were traveling through those areas, we sometimes used to ask people from FUNDAP, can you just stop here? Can we work here for a minute? And Ben and I my teammates and I, we used to get down and just spend half an hour or 1 hour just brainstorming there instead of going back to our rooms and talking there. And they were open to these kind of things. And in fact, they enjoyed it along with us.
That's great. Now, I'm wondering if there's anything in particular you really felt you learned from a business perspective throughout this experience.
The most important thing is building credibility. Little actions go a far way. Other person has to be interested. Other person has to understand that you have their best interest in mind, and one way to actually show that is taking true, genuine interest in what they're doing and why they're doing. So we had a small project. We could have run with that project, but it was more important to just take a step back, understand what's the overarching vision, what is driving this new initiative, and empathizing with that vision was very, very important. Once they understood that we have their vision at heart, especially when we're working with non-profits, and we can understand their constraints and we can understand their beneficiaries' constraints, that goes a long way. And the second most important way to bolster that credibility is by asking a lot of relevant questions. When you are asking questions, it's an immediate signal that you're thinking about it, you're processing, you're running your brains on it. And once you start asking those genuine questions, other person is curious and opens up to give you more and more information.
So Veena, it sounds like you had a really amazing experience. I'm wondering if you have any advice for students who might have a similar opportunity.
So First thing is, if you have this kind of opportunity in front of you or any other kind of opportunity, never, ever, ever pass it up, because this is not just a personality building kind of experience, but this goes a long way in your professional development. And the second most important takeaway from this entire experience is team building. 3 people in a different country don't speak the same language. There is no other better team building exercise than this.
Veena, thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome, and thanks for inviting me once again.
That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any questions or suggestions for a future episode, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.